Endeavor here. This video will be an after-action report on the debate I had on whether or not liberalism destroys civilizations. I've seen other channels do the same kinds of videos, so I decided I'd do one on this debate because I have a lot to say. This isn't going to be my chance to take cheap shots at the participants. I'm glad they came on, and I think we had a productive conversation. After the debate, I think I was able to hammer down the major disagreement in the anti-progressive movement that separates people like myself, David Cedarwood, and others on the far right from the Liberalists, Zarathustra Serpent, and Sargon of Akkad. There's one concept that came to my mind after the debate, and as I rewatched it, I really saw this playing out throughout the conversation. What came to my mind was the game theory model of the prisoner's dilemma. I thought of this because it really represents how I see the solutions to the many problems we discussed differently from the liberalists. For those of you who don't know, the prisoner's dilemma is a hypothetical situation that goes as such. Two members of a criminal gang are arrested and imprisoned. Each prisoner is in solitary confinement and has no means of communicating with the other. The prosecutor lacks sufficient evidence to convict the pair on the principal charge. They hope to get both sentenced to a year in prison on a lesser charge. Simultaneously, the prosecutor offers each prisoner a bargain. Each prisoner is given the opportunity to betray the other by testifying that the other committed the crime, or to cooperate with the other by remaining silent. The offer is that if A and B betray each other, each serves 2 years in prison. If A betrays but B remains silent, A will be set free but B will serve 3 years in prison, and vice versa. If A and B both remain silent, both will only serve 1 year in prison on a lesser charge. So the scenario is that if both remain silent, then they each serve 1 year in prison, making the total years in prison 2. If one betrays but one remains silent, one will serve 0 years in prison, and one will serve 3, making the total years in prison served 3 years. If both betray, each will serve 2 years in prison, making the total years in prison served 4. So the best scenario is that the two of them both cooperate, and they both serve 1 year in prison, making the total years in prison only 2. However, by cooperating with each other, they run the risks that the other will betray, and the other will come out with a better outcome, and their outcome will be significantly worse. In terms of politics, let's suppose that one prisoner is the left and one prisoner is the right, or one prisoner is the progressive coalition and the other is the voices that oppose it. That camp would include both myself and the dissident right and the classical liberals. We see many of the same threats to the world, such as Islam, progressivism, mass migration, but have decided upon different solutions. I believe the liberalists are looking at the world similar to how you would look at the prisoner's dilemma. Clearly, the best solution to the prisoner's dilemma is for both to remain silent and accept the minimal penalty. I think this is the solution that the liberalists tried to present me during the debate. They believe that the answer to the political divides of the present day is for everyone to accept liberal values. They believe that mutual respect for each other's rights, free discourse, and the rejection of identity politics is the solution. They believe that we can achieve this through the democratic process. This is the equivalent of choosing to cooperate in the criminal's dilemma and hoping the other side does the same, thus minimizing the amount of conflict between the two sides. Where I differ from them is how I see this prisoner's dilemma that we are in. They see it as a purely rational decision in the abstract. Where I disagree is that I believe the past few years have shown us what option our opponents have chosen in this criminal dilemma. They have chosen to betray. Thus, I believe the best option is to betray also. Agreeing to cooperate would result in a total victory for the progressive coalition and a total defeat for us. They will gladly use identity politics. They will gladly deplatform their opponents. They'll gladly use authoritarianism, and given the chance, they'll gladly take away our liberties. This is why I cannot see a liberal solution to the many threats we are facing today. If you're up against an opponent that is not willing to play by the principles of liberalism, it makes no sense to do so yourself because it will result in certain failure. And this is my problem with liberalism. It subsidizes its own subversion. I believe that a civilization should not be defined by some vague set of political values. There must be something concrete and eternal. the people, their shared identity, and their way of life. That was my argument. This should be the highest purpose for a civilization. And the problem is that the modern Western liberal democracies do not have this, and their democratic systems are being used to shape the society at the will of those who are in power right now. Zarathustra's serpent agreed that a state should have a protected identity like his country Israel does for the Jews. Where we disagreed was that he believed liberalism was completely compatible with nationalism, and that the democratic process would fix the problems that the West is in today. With all due respect, I think his sense of optimism is due to the different situation Israel is in from the West today. Western countries do not have a protected people, identity, or culture. The majority population does not have any protected status whatsoever. And on top of that, the politicians running these countries have a vested interest in seeing the majority population become smaller and smaller because they know that they can use mass migration and identity politics to form larger voter blocs. The solution he proposed was that when these bad decisions were made, the political pendulum would swing in the other direction and fix them the next election cycle. Now, if this were Britain or Canada in 1920, this might be true. They were homogenous states back then, and for the most part, the interests of the individual would have been what mattered. But we're not in that situation right now. The Democratic Party in the US wants to open the southern border as wide as possible. They want mass migration because they know that they can win the majority of the Hispanic vote. The Labour Party in Britain and the Liberal Party in Canada want as many Muslims in the country as possible for the same reason. In order to win that vote, they'll create policies that favor these migrant populations. They'll benefit at the expense of the decreasing white majorities because there's only a certain amount of resources to go around. They'll give it to those who vote for them. And this is not something that can be fixed in the next election cycle. It's irreversible through liberal means. Demographic shifts make progressive victories permanent and limit any possible counter-movement against them. Zarathustra spoke about the need for tolerance and used the 1960s as an example. Tolerance is a virtue of liberalism, but again, it's another virtue that can be used against itself because since the 1960s, tolerance has been a one-way street. The more tolerant whites are, the more extreme the rhetoric in the media and academia against us gets, and the more legislation is passed against us. Again, Israel would never tolerate the same rhetoric being directed towards Jews that's directed towards the white majority in Western nations. China would never tolerate that rhetoric being directed towards Chinese people. And the reason the left gets away with this is because there's no collective of the white majority, making anti-white rhetoric extremely appealing to potential voter bases. Another example he brought up was homosexuality and same-sex marriage, and this was the result of the changes in the 60s, which he defined as liberal. The traditionalist view is that the purpose for sexuality, relationships, and marriage is to encourage reproduction. This is its purpose in nature, after all. In the 60s, the purpose changed from reproduction to feelings. This is what justified same-sex marriage, which Zarathustra called liberal, but once this idea was taken to its logical conclusion, today it's being used to justify gender pronouns and gender reassignment for children. They said this was not liberal, but the underlying belief that SJWs hold on gender today came exactly from this idea of sexual liberation in the 1960s. I feel that the solutions put forth by the liberalists might have made sense in the abstract, but where I strongly disagreed with them was the effectiveness of their strategy in the world today. The answers for the problems of identity politics from the left was to reject them as a whole. They said that education would be key to teaching liberal values. The real problem I had with this answer was that it's not something that we can implement in practice. We don't have control of the education system, the progressives do, and they will shut out anyone they deem a threat to their power. The left will never give up identity politics because it's worked so effectively for them. The example we discussed was Jeremy Corbyn. The response I got was that Jeremy Corbyn's not liberal. Well, that's kind of the point, though. Jeremy Corbyn is using the liberal system to subvert liberalism and implement something that's illiberal. If he gets into power, he will restrict freedom of speech, he will open the borders, and he will implement pro-Islam policies, and he will force gender ideology on children. Liberalist policies have no way of preventing the far left, who have enormous political power right now, from implementing these sweeping policies which do away with liberalism once they're given the chance. The answer I got was that liberalism is very difficult. And with that, I have to agree. The path we are going on, it does seem that liberalism will be extremely difficult, and if I had to bet, I'd say it'll be impossible. So my recommendation is this. In the prisoner's dilemma we are in, our opponents have decided not to cooperate. If we want a fighting chance against them, we need to do the same. We're going to need to start engaging in identity politics. If we're going to have a chance at stopping mass migration and anti-white rhetoric, there needs to be a white identity and its own interest group. We're going to need to start pushing for group interests. We'll need to start forming coalitions of interest groups, just like the progressives have done. Ethnic groups, religious groups, cultural groups. We need to find the groups that have a vested interest in seeing the progressive coalition come apart and rally them into one single cause. We need to start standing up for ourselves. We need to start taking part in boycotts, protests, and start applying pressure on progressive institutions. We need to stop taking abuse on the chin. You might say these are the tactics of our enemies, but they're the tactics that work. If principle exceeds all practicality, then it's probably not a principle that's worth holding on to. So on the question of the debate, does liberalism destroy civilizations? I will say this. Civilizations are not built on liberalism, and liberalism alone cannot sustain one. It must have a foundation in an identity and way of life, and that is what must be upheld. Maybe then liberalism can work. What we cannot have is a system which undermines the societal foundation. One thing Benedict said during the debate was that we need more of a cultural movement rather than a political one. And I agree. It's the culture that matters. We need to build a new cultural foundation. That's what has to come first. But culture pushes politics, and there's going to need to be a system in order to preserve that culture. I don't believe that liberalism is the best system to do that. If you ask any people throughout history if they had a right to their land and to preserve their culture, they would say yes, and that would be non-negotiable. Everywhere in the world outside the West today would give the same answer. But the leaders who have inherited this liberal society answer the question with an overwhelming no. They aren't particularly concerned if the culture and lineage that built their nations ceases to exist. You can argue if they're liberal or not, but they're the ones running these liberal democracies. This is the end result of liberalism in the West. And down the road, we really need to question if this is the system that we want. Again, thank you for everyone who participated in the debate. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and follow me on Twitter. Link in the description. Thank you for listening. Till next time, endeavor.